Hello, everyone. Welcome to the ILR faculty panel, The Impact of COVID-19 on the Labor Market. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Emily Blanchard. I am a junior in ILR and a student worker in the Office of Student Services, and I am co-hosting this panel tonight with Hanni.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hanni Wiegand, and I'm a sophomore in the ILR school. I'm also a student worker in the ILR Office of Student Services. Joining us today, we have Allison and David with the Cornell ILR Learning Innovation. They'll be here if we have any issues with technology. And then behind the scenes, we have Jesse and Rebecca, advisors in the Office of Student Services. And then Dean Colvin will be our facilitator for this event today.
So we decided to host this panel tonight for several different reasons. As ILR students, Hanni and I have found it difficult to stay engaged with the ILR community and faculty members when we haven't been on campus these past couple of weeks, and we assumed that other students were feeling the same way. So we sent out a poll to all of the ILR students where they could send in recommendations for activities and events that they would like to be attending and have hosted virtually that would help everyone feel more connected at this time. And the faculty panel was one of the most requested activities by this poll. And we also recognize that COVID-19 is a pressing and relevant issue that is going to impact everyone. So we really think that everyone has something valuable to learn from this panel tonight.
So the primary focus of this panel is to present the research and hypotheses of professors about the impact of COVID-19 on the labor market. It is not meant to be a career panel. So if you have questions about how COVID-19 is impacting your career aspects, please check in with the ILR Office of Career Services. Now I'm going to give a quick run through of how this panel is going to go. So we're going to do introductions of Dean Colvin, and then we will move on with panelists who will discuss their research and hypotheses, and they have 3 to 4 minutes for that. And then Dean Colvin will facilitate questions sent in by students in advance. And finally, we have a live Q&A session for the last 20 to 25 minutes.
Also, just so everybody knows, the entire panel tonight will be recorded and posted on the ILR website. So throughout the entirety of the event, the panelists will have their videos on, as you can see right now, and the attendees will have their microphones and videos turned off. So attendees, the way that you will communicate is through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And feel free to send in any questions you have throughout the entire panel. And these questions will be asked to the panelists at the end during the live Q&A section. And we will not state your names when we read these questions out loud, so they will be totally anonymous. And also the program tonight will not be live captioned, but once it is recorded and posted on the website, the live captioning will be available.
So as Emily said, that we ask you to type your questions throughout the panel rather than at the end, so we can kind of filter through them. You can ask your question to a particular panelist, or you can leave it up to everyone on the panel board. Let us know if you're an alum, staff, or student, as this event is open to more than just ILR students. We have over 500 participants, which is just amazing. We're going to try and do our best to get to everyone's questions, but obviously we won't be able to get to everybody, but we'll do the best we can.
Great. So now we are excited to introduce our facilitator for the night. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce Alexander Colvin, the Kenneth Kahn Dean and Martin Scheinman Professor of Conflict Resolution at the ILR School at Cornell University. His research and teaching focuses on employment dispute resolution with a particular emphasis on procedures in non-union workplaces and the impact of the legal environment on organizations. His current research projects include empirical investigations of employment arbitration and a cross-national study of labor and employment law changes in the Anglo-American countries.
Welcome, Dean Colvin. Can you tell us a little bit more about your research and interest as it relates to COVID-19 and the impact on the labor market? And then can you please introduce our lovely panelists?
Sure, happy to do so. And thanks, Hanni and Emily, for organizing this. Yeah, you put a lot of work into this, and it's really great to see this panel come together. This is obviously a really important topic right now. We're struggling with the public health consequences of COVID-19 and the pandemic, but we're already seeing the economic impact starting to bear on the nation. We have about a 5% drop in GDP in the first quarter, which is really stunning. But more stunning to me is that we've had somewhere in the range of 25 million Americans file for unemployment insurance over the last 5 weeks, which is really a catastrophic situation in terms of our labor force and the human toll of that. We're expecting to see really catastrophic unemployment numbers coming up. For myself, looking at this, I'm a conflict resolution researcher. I look at workplace conflict, how people deal with conflicts over their rights in the workplace. And that's certainly something where we're seeing a lot of issues arising out of this pandemic. So the issues arise around things like issues of the impact on workers, layoffs and furloughs of workers have been controversial. Issues around rights to a safe and healthy workplace are something that's certainly implicated in what's been going on under the pandemic. Something that I've been particularly interested to see is the spate of worker protests that have risen up. So over time in America, we'd seen a long decline of the strike as a weapon used by workers to protect their interests. This really goes back to the 1970s to the present. We've seen a steady decline in strike rates and just less use of the strike as a weapon. We started to see the last couple of years maybe a shift in that. You may remember the Red for Ed teacher strikes that we saw in a number of states, where teachers, even teachers who didn't have collective bargaining rights, using walkouts and strikes to advance their interests. Well, it's interesting to see that in this pandemic situation, we've seen a number of walkouts of workers in different situations. There was a group of sanitation workers in Pittsburgh who walked off the job about their safety concerns. There were some poultry workers down in Georgia who walked off the job. And there's been other actions. We're seeing conflicts in Amazon warehouses where there's been termination of workers. We're seeing an increase in conflict. And this is something we've seen in the past in some catastrophic economic times. In the 1930s was a period of economic conflict, and we're seeing a resurgence starting in that area. So I'm certainly looking over the next while to see if we see a broader resurgence of workplace conflict during this period. So that's something I'm keeping my eye on and seeing how this plays out. I'm joined here today by 5 of my fantastic colleagues here from the ILR school. So I'm just going to introduce you quickly to them and give them a chance to spend a few minutes talking about their own interests and the own work and thoughts that they have in this area. So my 5 colleagues are Rosemary Batt, who is the Alice Cook Professor of Women and Work in the HR Studies and International Comparative Labor Departments. George Boyer, who's our Senior Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and also Professor of Economics and also International and Comparative Labor. Nellie Brown, who's Director of ILR's Workplace Health and Safety Programs. I think that is actually the only scientist we have amongst our cohort, so especially valuable in these times. My colleague Risa Lieberwitz, Professor of Labor and Employment Law, a fellow member with me of the Department of Labor Relations Law and History. And last but not least, Russell Weaver, who's an economic geographer and is Extension Associate in our ILR's Buffalo Co-Lab, where Nellie Brown's also based out of our Buffalo office. So it's great to have all 5 of them here today. I'm going to give each of them about 3 or 4 minutes to talk a little about their own work and thoughts relating to this area. So Rose Bhat, to start us off. And I believe you're still muted, Rose.
Of course. Thank you. Of course. So anyway, thank you to the students, Emily and Hanni, for putting this together, and for all the people who are joining us. I think it's a great opportunity, and I really hope we continue to do these kinds of things. So briefly, my research focuses on how Wall Street firms and financial actors affect Main Street companies and workers, and how that in turn leads to inequality. And so in the context of COVID, I've been writing a number of op-eds and articles about how this is playing out. And so I'm going to give you two quick examples. The first is from a small town hospital in Easton, Pennsylvania, that is owned by a for-profit hospital chain. And that chain is in turn owned by a private equity firm that has a lot of financial engineering tricks that it uses when it takes over a company. In March, the for-profit chain sent a letter to the Pennsylvania governor saying that it was going to close immediately unless it got a government bailout. And so now many small hospitals are really hurting. So why is this hospital in particular deserving of a government bailout? Well, it turns out that Easton Hospital is much worse than other hospitals, because when the private equity firm took it over, it immediately used 70% debt that it put on the hospital chain to buy it. And then it immediately sold the property underneath the hospital for hundreds of millions of dollars that it gave back to itself. And then made the hospital charge high rent on property it had owned since 1890 when it was first formed. And so the governor was under threat, and he caved and said, okay, I'm going to give $8 million a month to this hospital that the private equity firm had run into the ground. Let me give you another quick one, and then I'll stop. The second story is from Seattle, a very highly respected emergency room doctor. They're working for 17 years. And he began complaining about the lack of protective gear. He became vocal. He was representing the interests of workers and patients. He was fired. But he wasn't fired by the hospital because the hospital did not employ him. He was fired by an emergency room staffing firm that had been given a contract, an outsourced contract to manage the emergency room. That staffing firm was owned by a private equity firm. And that private equity firm, Blackstone, the founder is a man named Steven Schwartzman, who is in the inner political circle of President Trump. And he did not want to be embarrassed by the worker speaking out, and so he fired him. Those are two examples of how the financial actors are seeking to gain from this kind of crisis, just as they gained in the 2008 crisis. And so what I'm doing, my hypothesis is that unless we correct the policies and really monitor these actors, we will get increased inequality coming out of this crisis.
Thanks, Rose. George Boyer.
Hi, hi everyone. I also want to thank Emily and Hanni for this. It's great. I'm an economic historian. Much of my research has been on how economic shocks affect labor markets, and also how governments, local and federal, deal with economic shocks. And I view the COVID pandemic that we're going through now as a massive shock. And one way to get a better understanding of what's going on now is to study public sector behavior during past pandemics. One could go back, and there's a fair amount of information on this, to the 17th century and study. We have lots of information on England and Italy during the plague epidemic of the 17th century. There's a wonderful novel on this, Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, which I highly recommend, although I started reading it right when we were forced to go home, and it creeped me out. I don't know if I stopped. But the point is, there is information, and the best information is on something that happened 100 years ago, the influenza pandemic of 1918-1919. I'm sure you all know about it now because it's been talked about, but just very quickly, it killed about 40 million people worldwide. Worldwide, it went from 1918 to 1920. In the United States, it killed somewhere between 500,000 and 675,000 people, depending on how you count pneumonia victims. It occurred in the United States in 3 waves. I think that's very important to remember. More on that in a minute. It begins in the US in March 1918. It basically dies out in the summer of 1919. So it lasts somewhere between 15 and 18 months. What's most interesting to me is, like today, cities in 1918 and 1919 implemented non-pharmaceutical interventions, or as I'm going to call them, NPIs, in order to slow the spread of influenza and reduce the number of deaths. These included school closings, church closings, theater closings, dance hall closings, cancellations of all public gatherings, funeral bans, quarantining those subjected or suspected of having contact with persons who were ill, and isolating those diagnosed as being ill. Much of this, by the way, was also done in 17th century Italy and in Britain in the cities when the plague started. I think from reading what I've been reading lately on the economics of 1918 to 1919, that there are 4 morals. So I'd just like to mention those quickly. The first, I've already said, the COVID virus is likely to come in waves. And what this means is we should not get overly optimistic and let our guard down when the number of cases and deaths declines in the next few weeks and months. That would be a huge mistake. Second, non-pharmaceutical interventions reduce death rates. The effectiveness of these non-pharmaceutical interventions depends on 3 things. One is how quickly they're introduced once cases begin in your area. Second is how aggressive they are. And the third is how long they are maintained. And here, and again, many of you may have seen this, but the classic examples are to compare Philadelphia and St. Louis. Philadelphia waited 2 weeks to implement NPIs after their deaths started. They let a large parade go by, and they had a gigantic spike in death rates. St. Louis introduced NPIs within 2 days. Their deaths went on longer, but if you add up the totals, they were far, far smaller. And St. Louis kept them up for 10 weeks. The third point is that non-pharmaceutical interventions not only save lives, they also might be of economic benefit in the medium to long run. In the short run, obviously, you shut down the economy. You essentially put the economy into a coma. But you also reduce deaths and you stop some of the chaos. In the longer term, in 1918-19, the economy performed better, it rebounded quicker in cities that had more aggressive non-pharmaceutical interventions. The final point is we should not expect the economy to jumpstart itself as soon as we go back to supposedly normal. Despite what the Treasury Secretary says or anyone else, there's no reason to believe this is going to happen. There's no reason to believe that once the bans are lifted, unemployment is simply going to shoot back down to about 4%. The point here is that we have a stimulus program in place. It's important to keep it up. So if we take the stimulus plan off, the economy could languish for some time. In parts of the US, the downturn lasted for over 3 years. So those are my points. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, George. Nellie Brown.
Okay. Well, I'm a certified industrial hygienist, so health and safety is what I do all across New York State, and providing both training and technical assistance. And of course, for a while now, my world has been all coronavirus all the time. I mean, when I get a chance to do a little training on, as I did Monday, on bed bugs in the workplace, it was a welcome relief. But I have an approach that I do in my training on coronavirus and my tech assist, in which I try to get people to understand the issue of communicable diseases in the workplace. The things that we do for coronavirus that we've been focused on right now work just as well for the flu. And a lot of them work perfectly well for gastrointestinal illnesses. And all of these are spread in the workplace as well. And through many of the same common methods. And as a result, what we do to address COVID is just as useful for these other things and will be just as useful in the future. So I definitely agree with George's assessment on that. In preparing my trainings, which by the way, my PowerPoints and so forth change usually several times a day because of the literature that keeps coming out that's new, because so much of what we're dealing with is on the cutting edge. And that has been a great, in a sense, frustration because I constantly have to change what I am dealing with or update it in some way. I have come up with several things that stand out to me about this issue besides the communicable disease issue generally. I am finding that when about 10 years ago, I tried to offer people more intense crisis planning and recovery planning, and particularly with a pandemic focus, which at that time was the flu, I couldn't get any takers. People gave the usual excuses, we'll think on our feet, we'll deal with it when it happens, that kind of thing, which of course obviously doesn't work. I found that in making my recommendations for what people should do in protecting themselves in the workplace, it's very frustrating to have to say to people, your best protection for airborne disease is a minimum N95 respirator, except people can't get them. When I'm trying to show people the difference between a respirator and a face mask, even though I'm making face masks for family and friends, I have to show them the differences and what you can and cannot expect a face mask to do. I found it extremely disturbing to see that, like any army that is going to fail if its supply chain becomes too attenuated. We've allowed our supply chains to become terribly attenuated. And when people say we won't probably get dispensers and containers of disinfectant wipes and so forth until the summer, it's because the raw ingredients are coming from China. So everything we're trying to get, coming from overseas has become a difficulty. I certainly would like to put in a plug for my own field and say that we are an aging workforce in the health and safety field. CIHs are an aging workforce. We need new blood, and I would highly recommend it as a career. And I think going forward, we're going to need more people in the health and safety field. I think we're going to see that the whole issue of health and safety as conditions of work becoming a driver. I'm hoping for more collective bargaining because people need that. They need a collective voice to address these things. And as you have heard from already from our other colleagues, people are using this issue of walkouts and strikes and so forth, even though they don't have a union, and yet they're trying to use the same tools. So obviously those tools are needed. So that's kind of what I'm seeing for my field at the moment.
Great. Thanks so much, Nellie. Risa Lieberwitz.
Great. Thanks so much to the planners, and thanks to everybody who's attending and to my fellow panelists for this really important discussion. So what I'm going to talk about today really brings together my interests in labor and employment law with specifically employment discrimination and discrimination more broadly. In particular, today I'll talk about discrimination against communities of color. And there's three main points that I want to make. I'll just give you the three and then say a little bit about them to begin with. The first is that it's essential that we have information about the realities of the disproportionately negative impact of COVID-19 on communities of color. Secondly, we must analyze the reasons for these inequalities. And as I'll discuss, particularly the systemic nature of these inequalities. And third, that we must use this moment to either commit ourselves or to recommit ourselves to social change for the now, the present, and as importantly in the future, so that we come out of this understanding information, analyzing it, and then being able to make change in the future. So let me say a little bit in the few minutes I have now about these issues, and hopefully we'll have time to talk about them later. So the first point in terms of understanding the realities on the ground, there's been a lot written now about the unequal impact of COVID-19 on communities of color. But what's interesting about that as well is how difficult it is to gather statistics to a great extent because the federal government failed to collect data on the race, ethnicity, and geography of the impact of this virus. And so we have to have that information, because when we do have the information that has been gathered in spite of the obstacles put up by the government, we see reports about Black Americans making up 25% of the deaths from this virus in the US, even though they make up a little under 13% of the US population. The large city reports are similar in terms of the disproportionate impact with regard to the deaths of people of color compared to others in the population. So that's the information issue that we must have. And then we can ask the question, well, why is there this disproportionately negative impact on the basis of race? Why are communities of color bearing the greatest burden of a virus that does affect everybody, but affects communities of color disproportionately? And that's where we get to the systemic issues, that what we're seeing now, what's been called are pre-existing conditions, not in the sense of medical pre-existing conditions, but the pre-existing systemic conditions of racial inequality in all aspects of US social and economic institutions. And the current moment we're in has replicated and exacerbated these pre-existing problems of inequalities in labor, where we see the disproportionately high level of low-wage jobs in agriculture, service work, meat packing, poultry processing plants, grocery stores, etc., where we now say that essential jobs are in these areas because they are essential and they always were, but now they're called essential, but we still have people in these low-wage positions who are now on the front lines being subject to the ravages of this virus. We also have immigrant workers who are disproportionately in these kinds of positions. So people of color, immigrant workers are taking the hit out on the front lines in ways that are systemic and that are not simply an accident. And so these are interlocking systemic problems in our society. They're interlocking systemic problems with regard to the workplace, with regard to then low wages in the workplace, lack of benefits, lack of access to healthcare, housing issues that affect the way in which the virus impacts different communities. And so when we see these as systemic issues in housing, the environment, healthcare, labor, then it tells us that we must address those issues systemically as well. Through social movements, the kinds of things people have already referred to today, that I hope we can talk about more in our discussions about unionization, and other collective action to change the laws in a way that goes to the systemic roots of the problem rather than a sort of specific, discrete treatment of the issues. So thanks very much.
All right, thank you, Risa. Rusty Weaver.
Hi, thank you to everyone for inviting me to be on this panel. It's really nice to be here. So I'm a geographer, and in just really one sentence, what I study most frequently are patterns of spatial inequality. So doubling down on what Risa was just saying, I try to understand the processes that generate patterns of spatial inequality, the patterns that link up with existing patterns of inequality and reinforce them, and then ideally and optimistically leverage points to intervene in those patterns to try to affect some sort of meaningful change. And so a lot of the work that I've been doing around COVID-19 to date has been trying to document, as Risa just said, a lot of the data aren't necessarily available or available in a very fine resolution to understand just how COVID-19 is disparately impacting communities of color and other vulnerable populations. But I've been trying to document that as best as possible with secondary data. And some of the findings probably won't surprise you given the headlines, but we've been able to put some numbers to a few of these disparities. And just as one quick example, so in the city of Buffalo, where I'm based, I've been aggregating and maintaining an active dynamic web map to show COVID cases by zip code and how they relate to patterns of race and ethnicity, poverty and income, housing cost burden, ownership, housing tenure, and things like that. And two zip codes that are side by side. One is a mixed-use, vibrant neighborhood in the city of Buffalo called the Elmwood District, where we have $1 million homes. It's a neighborhood that's won awards from the American Planning Association for its design. And that shares a border with the zip code 14209, which is on the other side of Main Street. That's a community of color, it's low income, it's predominantly African American. And just looking at those two zip codes side by side, the rate of COVID cases per 1,000 people in that nice Elmwood neighborhood is currently two cases per 1,000 people. In the neighboring zip code, it's 14, right? So that's a remarkable disparity, and we're trying to call attention to those issues. And so my interest in COVID-19 as a geographer really lies in two interrelated dimensions. And one are the scalar properties of COVID-19, of this crisis in particular. And by that, I mean, what we're starting to see is that the way that we're going to get through this crisis in one aspect depends on a very fine resolution, a very fine spatial scale, the community. It's strong communities, diverse community economies, and local economies where we're seeing some of the innovation from this virus, where we're starting to see solutions coming up from the grassroots. On the other hand, we're also seeing the need for very strong state and federal institutions. And so we're having this renewed interest in a strong public sector. And that's a very coarse-grained scale of analysis that applies everywhere. And we can even think about global institutions of health and cooperation that are meaningful in this crisis as well, because it's affecting everyone. And so the second dimension of what I'm interested in is how this crisis is potentially going to, as Risa was just saying, promulgate some sort of sense for or demand for systems change, and how those institutions, which, let's be fair, are well known for their inertia, might start to transform, take on new shapes, and how this crisis might be generative and create new institutions that allow us to anticipate and get through crises without all of the hiccups and inequality and reinforcing these spatial patterns of inequality that we currently see. So that's a lot of the work that I'm interested in. The hypothesis that I was going to put forward was the same that Professor Bhat already did. And so I do see that without some sort of fundamental systemic change, or really series of connected changes, that we are going to see reinforcing patterns of inequality. Some of these disparities that we see are just going to continue to get worse. And so since that hypothesis has already been put forward, I'll throw out a pie in the sky one that I mentioned to a colleague last week, and now it's some news from today and maybe shed some light on that could be feasible. And one is, along these lines of this crisis reshaping our institutions and our collective appetite for doing things differently, one of those institutions that might be affected is our electoral system. And we might begin to see, because of some of the disagreements in how, what policies are relevant for overcoming the crisis, how are we going to manage it, we might start to see some appetite for third parties in the United States system. And just today, Justin Amash's potential presidential candidacy is casting some light on maybe there is an appetite for a third party to get stronger, and our strong two-party system to begin to never sort of whittle away, but at least to become somewhat weakened because of this crisis. So those are basically my interests. If you do want to see some of that data that I was referring to, so ILR just launched a wonderful hub where we're trying to provide some resources. So we did a piece out of our Buffalo office recently that tried to map and really call attention to the disparities in workers who are most at risk of mass layoffs due to COVID-19 and workplace closures. So we have a piece about that on the hub. We also have a blog site that's highroadpolicy.org, where you can find that interactive web map and look at some data for specific regions inside of New York State rather than the state as a whole.
Great, thanks very much. And I do want to give a shout out to all the work that's being done that we're putting on the web about what's been going on. There, if you go into the ILR homepage, ilr.cornell.edu, there's a link to the hub for information on COVID-19 and work, including contributions from a number of our faculty and a lot of information about important issues there. So please do check that out. Now we're going to turn to some questions. I'm going to start with some questions that were pre-submitted by students. So we're going to start working through those. Those of you who are participating, though, please do go to the Q&A function and put in your questions there. Hanni and Emily are monitoring those, and we'll be asking some questions from those after we do some initial questions from the pre-submitted ones. I'm going to start with a couple of questions that are historical in nature. So this will be directed to George Boyer, our resident economic historian. Students were asking about how do you think this pandemic will affect labor's relationship with government? After crises like the Great Depression, the government stepped in and provided the security employers could no longer provide for workers, which led to labor forming a relationship with the government, and related questions around past crises such as the World Wars, which led to some cooperative relationships between labor and the government. What developments will this pandemic have on labor's relationship with the government? So what lessons can we learn from the history there?
Well, I think one of the lessons we learned from history, and I hope we continue to learn it, although we're in a very divisive era, is that both the Great Depression and the First and Second World Wars created more social affinity between classes. Without the Second World War, the adoption of the British welfare state certainly would have been delayed, and the adoption of welfare states in other countries. If you look at Britain, right after the evacuation of Dunkirk and when the bombing was beginning of British cities, there was an immediate, even though the United States was not in the war and it looked like Germany was about to obliterate Britain, there was an immediate call for more social welfare policy, for the development of a new Britain, or as it was sometimes called, a new Jerusalem. And this was absolutely amazing. And it seems to be because of this new affinity. The people who were being bombed in the cities and killed on the battlefront were people of all classes, and different classes bonded together. Similarly, it's hard to imagine we could have gotten the Social Security Act passed in 1935 if it hadn't been for the Depression. People who would have been dead set against social policy before that banded together and passed it. After World War I, Britain adopted several policies as well. So this does matter. That's the good news. The bad news is, of course, that this social affinity, this there but for the grace of God go I, does not last. It wears down over time. So what does this mean for us today? My belief is it means that we really want to change the administration in the fall. And if we get a change in administration in the fall, we might actually be able to get healthcare back. We might be able to not only bring back what's been taken away from Obamacare, but we might be able to push forward. I'm hoping that most Americans today are looking at this, and I agree with Risa and Professor Wheeler that that this is hitting people of color more than others, but it is hitting everybody. And I hope that we will have more people feeling affinity towards each other, that this can happen to any of us, and that therefore we will get more social policies. Whether we will or not, I don't know, but it's time to strike. And if I may just say one other thing very quickly about this, I don't think the labor market's going to be good this summer and the fall. It might be a good time for those of you who are graduating from college to go out there and join campaigns and campaign like crazy. Okay. Okay.
Well, that's a nice segue in terms of the students into a question around the impact on the labor market for the class of 2020. So Rusty Weaver, I'm going to throw this one to you. There's a question about, how do you think this will impact hiring once the economy turns back on? A huge rush to rehire post-COVID, slow rehiring, no rush at all, higher unemployment. So particularly, what are the difficulties you can see for the class of 2020 entering the labor market? certainly, I think related to that, the impact on colleges and college students.
Right, so that will be very sectoral specific, of course. So there are still going to be a number of prominent institutions that are going to be under hiring freezes. And so there is going to be a lot more hesitation to go out and fund and create new permanent positions. So there is going to be a bit of a scramble. And so I couldn't agree any more with Professor Boyer that the summer is a great time to go out and get that extra experience on your resume, because the places that will be hiring, of course, are active grassroots campaigns. I know the New York State Department of Labor is still hiring for various reasons, but the job market is going to be, I don't want to startle anyone or to scare anyone, but there is going to be a lot of uncertainty that's still there. And so for undergraduate students in particular, a lot of the entry-level positions that are normally around aren't necessarily there well funded because they haven't been deemed essential. And so there are going to be a lot of growing pains, I think, as we come out of this for any grad students who might be on, or undergrad students who are thinking about their opportunities and seeing that it's still a little fuzzy. There's still an opportunity to go back to grad school, of course, but for any grad students who are thinking about jobs, especially in higher education or anything like that, I think we're not at a point right now in the timeline of this pandemic to be able to say with any sort of certainty that you're going to be in a good position to go out there in the fall and find something. And so certainly finding those opportunities to build capacity of campaigns and organizations that are trying to get us through collectively this pandemic is going to be a valuable place to go out there. Apart from that, we're starting to see, because of this pandemic, which sectors are a bit more pandemic proof. So we've learned over time which sectors are more recession proof. But now, certainly looking at healthcare, at things like grocery stores and other essential services, we're learning about the jobs that are pandemic proof and the workers that are essential to the functioning of our day-to-day economy under the worst of circumstances. And so that's certainly going to change, I think, the landscape of jobs as well. Because that's where investment and reinforcement is happening right now into those particular sectors. So I don't know how good of an answer that is to that question, but it's also partially me hedging my own bets, because trying to make a prediction about the job market right now, given where we are in the timeline, is a very risky position. And so I would just, again, echo Professor Boyer's claim and say, look at the opportunities to get out there and do some grassroots organizing.
Yeah. I want to pick up on the mention of essential workers. I'll throw this question to Risa Lieberwitz. There's a question that was asked by a student about what are the boundaries for who are considered essential workers in our society? What does that reveal about the racial and economic disparities in the working class?
Great. Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that it's a great question, and the concept of essential workers is such an interesting concept right now that in some ways forces people to look at the realities. If we're going to say that certain people are essential now because of the fact that they are essential in getting food to the table, whether it's from the fields or from the meat packing and poultry processing plants, whether it's the people in the grocery stores or other retail stores that we rely on, the people in the Amazon warehouses, the people in restaurants who are doing takeout and delivery, the people in healthcare. And now I'm going to focus on the lower wage people in healthcare who are essential, but perhaps not in the spotlight as much, the people in the laundries, the people who are doing the healthcare aid work, very low wage workers. It can force us to, as a society, ask if these are people who are essential, and if these are people who are doing work that is low wage, how can we sustain, how can we live with that kind of disparity? How can we live with the disparity between these essential workers and the way in which we treat immigrant workers, whether they are documented workers or whether they are undocumented or unauthorized to work in the US. So I think the ethics of these issues is really brought to the fore. And we have to ask these questions as a society. So if people are essential in their essential jobs, then as people, they are also essential. And rather than only then looking at the ethics, which are moral and at the center of this, it again brings us back to that issue of what does this say about race and racism and racial inequality and inequalities on the basis of citizenship status in a country that relies on people at this essential way and yet treats them so poorly in the workplace. So it seems to me that this is the key that we have to continue to look at. To perhaps disagree just a bit with George Boyer's comments before, in terms of how we deal with this, we're in a systemic situation with systemic problems. These systemic problems were created by an economic system that's based on class, race, and gender inequalities, just to pick out a few. And they're going to be fixed systemically, not by the goodwill of some short-term affinity and as a class-based affinity or social affinity. As George, you pointed out, this is short-term because at the base of this is still the vast inequalities of power and wealth. And so it's the building up of the labor movement and alliances with other social movements that's going to give us the chance to recognize that class conflict and to lead towards real social change.
So I've got a question I'm going to throw to Nellie Brown. She's got her hand up, but I'll let her speak and then also throw a question to her, because one of the groups that we've all come to appreciate, I think, is more essential than we might have 2 months ago, a relatively low age group, is grocery store workers. When we do go out and we're getting the essential foods, we see those workers, we interact closely with them. And when we think about that kind of safety issue of the workers, that's one where we're directly seeing the interactions with them. So how are grocery stores protecting their workers, and how should they be protecting their workers? Nellie.
Actually, I wanted to quickly add something to what Risa was saying. And that is when you look at these essential workers who are very heavily in percentages people of color, these jobs are not ones that can be done remotely. These people must work and must take the risks associated with that. And at the same time, if they don't have the proper protections, we can't protect them not just from the disease, but for many of them, the chemical products they're using for cleaning and disinfecting, the ergonomic issues of the work that they're doing. They face all of these, and there's no real choice here. You either decide you're going to work or you quit, and there you are, which is not really a choice when you think about it. So to get back to the grocery workers, I co-authored some grocery store guidance, actually, which is on the Cornell Digital Commons, and you can download it. The things that I have seen really with them are a mixture of items from the hierarchy of controls. I mean, some of them certainly you could try as an employer to screen your employees as they come into work, check them for temperature and symptoms, and turn away those who are obviously ill. But that's a very coarse screen, as we realized, that you're only going to get some predominant symptoms. And even the CDC has acknowledged that, and in recent days has put more symptoms on its accepted list. But people don't think of diarrhea. They don't think of sinus headaches. They don't think of that stuff as being related to COVID. So it's a very coarse screen to act at that point and keep the sick people home. Well, so they come into work. Okay, well, if they're working, restocking shelves and so forth, I'm concerned about them wearing appropriate respiratory protection, which of course they're having trouble getting. So they're face masks, which are not great. And I have mixed feelings about gloves. My view of that is that since this is not a disease which enters through the skin, the issue of gloves is not going to really be any different from bare skin. It's not an issue there. But these are people who, in stocking these shelves, may be working extremely long hours. I'm concerned about sleep deprivation. which weakens the immune system further. I'm concerned about generally how these are scheduled. And then you look at the cashiers, and there you can do a bit with engineering controls, because certainly you can put up clear plastic barriers so that that can act as sneeze and cough guards and protect the customer and the cashier from each other. And of course, people can wear masks, and you can require people to wear masks to come in your store as well, and hope that they will. And that's some help, certainly. But I think a lot of this is making sure that people have their breaks as workers, that they have the ability to do hand washing. Because hand gels are lovely, but that is not really successful if your hands are dirty. They need to be washed. People need to take their breaks, however much they're pressed to keep working, to stock shelves and so forth. I think we need to be very cognizant of how people do, in fact, do hand washing, what kind of facilities they have for that, how their restrooms are set up and so on. And I think you need really people who are simply dedicated staff to go around the store cleaning and disinfecting the commonly touched things. That's the reality. And I often talk to people about things they might not think about, which is I ask employees to secure their hair. One of the problems we have as humans is we unconsciously touch our faces some 15 to 24 times a day, not even realizing we're doing it. And if we need to just brush our hair out of our face, we're going to have the same problem of touching our faces and getting the virus in through the mucous membranes of the tear ducts or in the nose or mouth. And so that kind of idea seems kind of a little odd to ask people about, but I try to do that anyway. I just think generally that we need to recognize that, as Risa was saying, that what we define as essential has taken on such a very different meaning now. And we need to really reconsider that as a society.
Great, thank you. There's been some questions put in about the question of technology in the workplace. So I'm gonna put to Rose Batt a question we've gotten about that. Obviously, we're doing a lot of working remotely, taking classes remotely. And we got a question from a student about what implications does working remotely during COVID-19 have on the expansion of technology in the workplace? What additional technological skills will applicants likely now need in order to stay competitive in the job market post-crisis? This is the Zoom lockdown as we're experiencing currently. But what's the broader impact of how this changes the trajectory of technology's impact in the workplace?
Right. So I've been looking at this to some extent. I'm not an expert on technology, but I did look back at, I have looked at firm strategies around restructuring and what they do in response to these kinds of crises. And, frankly, it's not great news. If we look at the experience of the 2008 financial crisis, we call it the Great Recession. We'll have to come up with a greater recession for this current period. And what happened is that as the financial crisis waned, companies did not replace workers at the level they had been before. They used labor displacing technologies to replace workers, and they also made greater use of offshoring. And so, I think that our concern has to be that everyone is getting more used to using various technologies and possibly, accepting them. And so things like, doing more use of Instacart and online grocery shopping, the retail industry will probably take a huge hit as people shift more to online shopping. And this is going to affect, going back to the systemic issues, disproportionately low-income frontline workers where those jobs are more likely to be displaced, whereas people like us, people who are educated and can have jobs that can be done more remotely, who have college, PhDs, whatever, we will be able to use those online benefits, if you will, and then disproportionately gain on the upside after the recession. I think, you know, one possible positive thing might be that companies allow people to work more from home, and that may provide an opening for more work-family balance. Not necessarily, but one of my Korean students recently said, well, you know, our companies never allow people to work remotely because they don't really trust them. You know, they've got to be in working so that they can monitor them. And he feels like this opportunity may be to allow people more flexibility in managing their own lives by trusting more that people will work remotely. That may be one of the upsides.
Yeah, you know, in your comments there, it makes me think back to some research you and I did a while back now, but looking at different employer strategies in the telecommunications industry and how they use technology company to company varied quite a lot, and workplace to workplace. And you know, one of the kind of messages out of a lot of that kind of student research that we and others have done is that there's a lot of variation in how companies respond. And I think we're seeing that again in this the responses to the pandemic. That you know, that there's a lot of workplace to workplace variation, and a lot is dependent on how you use things. Things aren't technologically determined to a single outcome. There's choices that can be made by leaders in different situations. I'm gonna now turn it back to Emily and Hanni to bring us in some questions from the Q&A that we've been getting. I want to make sure that we get to the questions from the participants online. So Hanni and Emily, do you want to pass some questions on to our panel?
Yeah, great. So again, please keep submitting any questions you have for the panelists. There's a bunch already in there, so we're not going to get to all of them, but we'll get to as many as we can. Hanni, do you want to ask the first one we have?
Yes. Okay, so this first question is for Dean Colvin. We noticed that you facilitated the NLLI online convening at the end of March. How are labor leaders responding to the pandemic?
Yeah, so that's our National Labor Leaders Institute, which is where we train kind of emerging leaders in the labor movement. And we had a really interesting discussion about how labor organizations are trying to respond to this. And there's a bunch of things they're dealing with at once. One thing very directly is trying to look after their members in the immediate situation where the members are subject to you know, safety threats. So you know, you're thinking things like the meatpacking industry, the unions there have been very concerned about the health industry unions, concerned about making sure that the healthcare workers have proper PPE. And that's something that's consuming a lot of the attention of the labor leaders we were talking to there directly. But at the same point, there's also the bigger issues going on, and particularly at the kind of national and state level, they're very concerned to try and figure out how they can help shape the broader economic responses, these sort of stimulus packages that are very necessary to help the economy out, but they can go in different directions, right? If we look across countries, there's a lot of variation. If you look at some of the countries like Denmark that have done a lot in terms of wage protection for workers there. That's a very particular way of doing the economic stimulus, and there's been a lot of variation there with American labor leaders doing what they can to try and push our economic stimulus packages in a way that will provide greater protections for workers. The thing I'm really worried about is state and local government, that we haven't seen much in the way of aid to state and local governments yet, and that's where there's a huge potential for negative impact on public sector workers. You think of teachers, schools, you think of healthcare workers. Many of those are employed by state and local government, and that's a real worry to me.
Great, thank you. The next question we have is from an ILR undergrad. They asked, once the pandemic is over, could a heavy investment in green energy and the creation of a new green industry help lift the economy out of recession? If so, how can labor legislation be properly amended to ensure that workers in this new industry are protected? And then Dean Colvin, I don't know if you want to direct to a specific panelist or.
Would anybody like to jump at that? Rusty, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Sure. So at least to the first part of it, to the questioner, yes, I completely agree. So I think you're seeing a lot of these proposals starting to come online now, variously under the heading of a Green New Deal. But the idea is essentially to couple some sort of federal jobs guarantee with investments into green infrastructure and green energy. And so alongside that, a parallel development is, at least for the first time in my lifetime, I'm also seeing an increased demand for and a movement back in the United States toward public ownership. And so that's starting to take off. And so this idea, especially in the pandemic, this notion that water utilities, water and other utilities are becoming more essential services, for lack of a better term, there's an increasing push to recapture those from the public sector, that private utility companies don't necessarily have the best interests of resolving a pandemic and looking out for everyone's well-being in mind. And so from various sectors, you're seeing these increased pushes for public ownership of utilities like water. You're also seeing calls like that for broadband infrastructure. And I think going back to a question that was asked recently on how the shift to remote work has really cast a light on different skills and different issues. One thing that's becoming increasingly clear is that you're not going to work remotely if you don't have high reliable access to broadband internet. And so there is an increasing movement now. It's been active for years, but now you're seeing more people move over to this camp of calls for public broadband infrastructure, and that's mirroring what's going on with the Green New Deal crowd as well, for calls for public investment into new energy infrastructure. There have also been a lot of campaigns. The Democracy Collaborative as an organization comes to mind. That's one of the thrusts of the so-called bailouts should be that they shouldn't be bailouts but buyouts, that the public sector is buying stake in some of these institutions that have a lot of power and a lot of control. And so green energy investment is one of the big bubbles in which that conversation is happening, because if, just as an example, oil companies are required to have a bailout, with all of the money that the US Treasury just pumped into the CARES Act, they could potentially acquire all of the biggest oil producers inside of the global economy. And so with that type of reasoning starting to get out there in the mainstream, this push for investment into green energy and creating jobs alongside that has reality. It has some traction going forward. It's still going to take a lot of lobbying, a lot of person-to-person relationships, and a lot of political power to mobilize to be able to make something like that happen. But yes, I think you're right on point with that question. That's one of the major directions that we're seeing the conversation begin to take shape.
The next question is, do you have any recommendations for how companies should manage reopening offices and managing societal fears?
Nellie Brown, do you want to, do you have any safety-related thoughts on that?
Oh, wow, I'm giving whole webinars on just that, as well as a lot of technical assistance. Wow, returning to work. Well, going right down the hierarchy of controls, I mean, a lot of this is, can you keep infected people out of your workplace, like the screening I was talking about earlier, but the idea of bringing people back to work very different hours, staggering the use of facilities so that you don't have as dense a number of people in your workplace or on your shop floor. Having people with staggered start and stop times for their work time so that you don't have a lot of crowds in locker rooms or at doorways. Just the whole idea of engineering controls, for example, like barriers of various kinds, improvements to ventilation, inspecting buildings when you go to return, because if they've been unused, standing water in lines can grow Legionella and build up dissolved lead and other problems. Buildings, need to be inspected for that. I think a lot of places are going to see the use of ultraviolet light at unused, unoccupied times for surface disinfection. Moving down the hierarchy, I think you're going to see a lot of administrative controls. We're still going to push social distancing, hand washing, and personal behaviors like that. I think we really need to seriously get people to look at how they interact with others in a workplace. And of course, cleaning and disinfecting, all those things we talked about as part of the essential worker idea, these all become much more intense. And then finally, with protective equipment, I think it's inevitable that you're going to see people being masked. I mean, it's not my ideal choice of PPE, but I think you're going to see a lot more interest in people being masked a lot, and how they deal with that. I think you're going to see a lot more interest in how people are trained to properly use the really good PPE, how to properly don and doff respirators, don and doff gloves, understanding the limitations of equipment. I think that's just a little preview, but I think you're going to see a lot of changes. I think a lot of workplaces are going to see themselves reorganized. A lot of chairs are going to, and desks are going to come out and get spaced differently. People aren't going to be meeting in as large groups. You're going to see, I think, a lot of people kept at home doing remote work. And I think a lot of interest in policy. I think a lot of workplaces, and particularly their HR departments, are going to have to do a lot of policy reexamination, and particularly for the protection of vulnerable workers as well. But I think policies overall, pandemic planning, I think, needs to be revisited, but policies on everything from people's leave, encouraging people to stay at home when they're sick. We don't want to encourage presenteeism at all. So I think there's a lot of change that you're going to see, and some of it quite startling. But some of these things, as I was arguing earlier, are just as good for the flu and other diseases as they are for coronavirus. Because if we publish the data every day on flu the way we do with coronavirus, I think people would be appalled. So a lot of the things we'll be doing really are good for any airborne disease or any disease spread through commonly touched surfaces. And I think those practices are going to continue.
The next question we have is for Professor Boyer on essential workers. So the student said that economists advised against high wages as part of FDR's New Deal because it would slow recovery. Will an increase in wages slow the unemployment recovery after the coronavirus? And the student also wants to know if there is one recession in particular to reference when comparing it to this pandemic, or if it's kind of unprecedented.
I think this really is this is not a recession that's driven by economic forces. I mean, there's obviously economic forces involved, but you can't really compare this to the Great Depression or anything else. One of the things that happened in the previous pandemics, most of them, which is I doubt going to happen here because of the difference in demographics, and it was an extraordinarily unfortunate thing, is that previous pandemics typically killed off prime age workers. And there were positive wage effects for all the wrong reasons. You had positive wage effects because you had a significant loss of life among prime age people. In 1918-19, the death rates were highest among people aged 15 to 40. The death rates were very low among people 65 and older. In that sense, this is very different. I think, along with Professors Wheeler and Lieberwitz, that this might be a time when essential low-skilled workers will have more bargaining power. I'm a little more optimistic perhaps than Risa on this, just that people will, some people, not everyone, but some people will feel more positive towards them and say, boy, they really are getting a bad rap, and it will help. Now, in terms of economists, well, we all know what economists say. Economists say demand curves slope downward. And if demand curves slope downward and you force wages up, you're going to lower employment. So if you force them up when there's no demand for them, that can be a problem. If, however, there is a demand for them, and I think there will be in this post-COVID-19 world, hopefully wages can go up. I don't see any reason why they can't. I don't think what's going to slow the recovery here is going to be what's happening to wages. I think it's going to be, are small businesses going to be able to survive this? Are they going to get some of the money that seems to be going disproportionately to very large corporations in the CARES Act? But are small businesses going to get it? Are we going to, are consumers going to be skittish? Are consumers, when we come out of this, going to say, oh my God, we've learned a lesson here that we need more precautionary savings and we're not going to spend any money on durables. We don't know what's going to happen again. Are firms going to be skittish about investing in anything? So I think those things are what's going to determine how fast we get out of the recession. And I think if we had an activist government with federal government with strong stimulus policies and with money going in the right places, I think we'll do better. I think it's great, by the way the UI system is being set up, that people who are losing their jobs now are not taking massive income hits. I think that's one thing that's being done that's really good. And that will help. But anyway, I'm not sure that answered the question, but I don't know the answer to the question. So.
Thank you, Professor Boyer. Okay, the next question is, what do you suspect will be the major barriers of the May Day strikers at Amazon and other corporations?
Do either Risa or Rose want to take a go? That Risa.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, I think that one of the themes that's coming out in what a lot of people are saying is that this is very much a moment where actions that we take as a society, whether that's particular workers joining together at a particular workplace, or let's say the AFL-CIO taking actions to create an agenda, alliances between the green movement, the labor movement, et cetera. This, I think, is really an extremely important moment to move forward. So in that way, I'm optimistic. And so I think that what these kinds of actions take that occur, whether they're strikes or other kinds of collective protests, is that it's reminding us that we're supposed to think about democracy in a society that calls itself democratic. So that we certainly have crises with regard to democracy in our political system, but we definitely do not have a democratic system in the economic system. And it's gotten less democratic as privatization has taken over, as the role of government in supporting worker rights has gotten weaker and weaker. So that these sorts of collective actions, I think, are part of a broader vision of bringing democracy back to the government, and also bringing democracy and democratic principles back into changes in the workplace, in the economic sector. So that if we can get a change in the government at the federal level, and hopefully we will, one of the first things that needs to be done is labor reform, so that the National Labor Relations Board, for example, can shift back to having people on it who believe in the National Labor Relations Act, and will help to actually make it an enforceable act for people's rights to unionize. Because we know from studies that have been done that workers want unions and they want collective representation, but they're afraid to unionize. Not only the low-wage workers that we've talked about today, who are really exploited in their low wages and poor working conditions. But generally, workers are afraid that if they'll unionize, they will lose their jobs. And so to actually bring democracy back to the government and to have a labor reform effort to create an agenda that enables workers to unionize and to collectively bargain and to set their own agendas in the workplace, I think is what can really make a difference. And protests and reminding ourselves that strikes can take place is one of those ways in which democracy can come back in.
Great. I see Professor Bhat has her hand raised. The question that I was about to ask is also directed towards you, so you will have an opportunity to respond and answer the next question. This question was, do you think that the COVID-19 crisis could actually open a window of opportunity for regulating private equity, at least in the healthcare sector or retail?
Great question. So first of all, I wanted to just build on Risa's point. One of the things I've also tried to understand is how you can think about social innovation or innovations in labor community movements. And we're at a moment to take advantage of really, I would say 40 years of experimentation at the local level. And so because we were stalled at the federal level, there's been all this bubbling up of activism at the local and state level that we all know about, the Fight for 15, the living wage campaigns, the minimum wage ordinances in the various cities, the kind of work that Rusty Weaver is doing in Buffalo, our own extension programs that have been in existence for a long time. And these movements, Black Lives Matter, et cetera, these are all built on young people who have really gotten their teeth in the fray and really have learned an enormous amount about how to mobilize. And so now we have an opportunity to use that institutional infrastructure that's been built over 40 years. And that's why, we had Black Lives Matter and Fight for 15, because they were building on this incredible history of people really working together. So I think that kind of is another reason to be hopeful about how we can push back and create constraints on bad behavior, at least. And that is a segue into the private equity stuff, because it's been surprising to me. I've been really focused on these federal responses, the bailouts, the CARES Act 1, 2, 3, 4. And it's been very interesting to me to see that so the small business loans were initially, designed for small businesses, and large businesses got the trough first. And then there's been massive pushback. There've been lawsuits. You even have Stephen Mnuchin, who's been saying, well, maybe not, And so because of the reputational effects and because of their concern, and because of the movement pushing, I think we have the opportunity to rein in the worst behavior. And I also point to things like things that were snuck into or got into the CARES Act, like paid sick leave. There's been a movement forever for paid sick leave. Okay, we're only going to get it for the COVID period, but that creates a platform for then doing more with it. And then the small business loans have particularly said no to private equity. So private equity firms, any firm that is like a chain or is a larger entity, cannot get that kind of money. And so there are some positive movements, and we just have to keep plugging away at those.
Thank you, Professor Bhat. The next question is, this pandemic has really revealed how dependent we have become on workers who are categorized as gig workers or contract workers. What kind of changes do you foresee the laws and policies on what constitutes gig work and what protections we grant contract and gig workers?
So maybe I'll answer that one myself. This is something that I think was already becoming a major public policy debate even before we got into the pandemic. So we saw the AB 5 legislation out in California that was basically codifying a California court decision, clarifying the definition of who is an employee. And that was being considered in other states as well. New York State had a vigorous debate about extension of that. I think what the pandemic's impact has done is to reinforce the importance of thinking about these issues, right? So that we see the importance of some of these gig workers, people doing food delivery, but at the same time, it raises those kind of questions, right? When you have the delivery to your home or to your apartment, what are you thinking about in terms of the safety of that worker? Those workers are going from place to place to place. They're being in contact with multiple people. What is their safety? How does that then interact with the customer? And I think that makes much more present that basic question of what are the protections that those workers are entitled to. And that's really fundamentally what the questions around status as an independent contractor or employee are about. The debate often gets confused because people jump to an assumption that if you're an employee, therefore it means something about how you do your work. That's not actually quite right. What it is it's a legal definition that means that you're entitled to certain legal protections. It doesn't actually determine some of the things people think it does about how the work is organized. You could actually organize work in a lot of different ways while still be under the protections of our labor and employment statutes. And I think that this economic crisis where we're seeing those gig workers in this different, more present kind of way is going to push us to, I think, think more seriously about what kind of protections they have.
Great, thank you, Dean Colvin. I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. This one's for Nellie Brown. Very soon after shortages of PPE became apparent, a few large corporations, such as Goldman Sachs and Apple, quickly donated millions of masks from their own stockpiles, which means they were likely engaged in some sort of crisis planning that predicted issues like these. What sets those companies apart from others, such as our government, that did not plan for these issues? And what lessons can companies learn about future crisis planning?
Wow. You tend to find when you look at studies of companies that do crisis planning is that they tend to have a better return on investment. They tend to do better. They stay in business longer. That doing any type of crisis planning enables you to head off crises earlier and make them non-events. And what this suggests about those companies is that they really did take seriously the idea that they could be vulnerable to this. I know in the past when I've done crisis planning with people, I'll push them through 11 different families of crises, and the idea of pandemic for so many people never strikes them as being important. And I said, well, if I got a whole bunch of people are out sick or caregiving, and you're the people that know most about your process are out sick or dead, and what do you do with that? People have to think about that. So it says a lot, I think, about a company if it's willing to invest that little bit of time. Now, in terms of the government has done pandemic planning. It did planning. In fact, it had a team that was under President Obama that did that, but it was dissolved under President Trump. There was, in fact, an actual crisis scenario that was run through in the fall of 2019. Some pretty high people in the government. I think even Rex Tillerson attended it, but nothing was done with the results. So this is something that I think is just a pathetic issue. I think a lot of the idea of a disease has been more likely to be interpreted as a weapon of terrorism rather than as a natural event. And so the attitude towards it is quite different at the government level. So yes, this is clearly very, very penny wise, pound foolish. If you think you don't want to spend the time now to do crisis planning, you're willing to think on your feet. Well, one of the truisms that comes out of crisis planning is that The injury or death of people or destruction of property cannot be invented in the heat of the moment. So you're not going to be able to do prevention of those things. Thinking on your feet in the midst of the crisis, that doesn't happen.
Thank you, Nellie Brown. Our last question is for Professor Lieberwitz and Rusty Weaver. What methods would be most effective for collecting data on communities of color right now? For the future, how should the government change the way it approaches population data?
So I can jump in on that first, and that's a really tough question, and one that's been at the center, I think, of the analytical community for a long time. So a lot of the indicators that we work with in trying to understand the disparate impacts of something like COVID-19 in real time are dated when they're even released. And so we rely a lot on especially US Census Bureau data. And with that, the timely information that we get from the Census Bureau, especially when we're looking at small geographies like something at a zip code and we're really trying to understand the impact at a community scale, those data are collected over a period of 5 years, and they have a lot of age to them, as I said, right when they come out. And so our ability to connect current crises to current data isn't really there at the moment. And so a lot of the information that we're getting from the crisis are not based on those old data sets, but they're coming from places like county executives and government task forces that have had to be impaneled for the specific crisis and to deal with it. And so what that shows me and folks like me is that there's a capacity to do this kind of outreach and to get more real-time information as long as we dedicate the time and funding to it. And so having something that's complementary, data dashboards at regional scales or at local scales that can complement census, the larger programs that we rely on for funding and to allocate federal and state pass-through funds would be a useful development to come out of, again, not trying to talk opportunistically about a pandemic, but it would be a useful outcome to come from something like this to show just the level of data that's necessary to be able to make real-time decisions and to get the resources that we're allocating to the people that need them most. So you might see a lot of cities and regions investing in open data portals. There are some large contractors out there that do that with cities right now. But then once that portal is up and running, you also have to have the task force and the personnel locally to be able to do things like temperature surveys to get out there into communities to do some canvassing. And so it might restructure the way that we're allocating personnel inside of, say, city and regional departments of planning.
I'll just say one thing really quickly, because I'm glad the person who's a geographer answered this question. But I would just point out the way in which this directs us to the role of government, right? And again, since the Reagan era, the role of government has really been under attack, and the results have been privatization and the just terribly unfair and unjust concentrations of wealth in the few and the many who are left without that kind of wealth and power. So that when we collect data, when we rely on actual data, whether it's population data, scientific data, the role of government is essential, and to put the funding into government being able to collect data, but also to think in terms of towards what end, right? Towards what goal. And it seemed to me that what Rusty was saying was very much around saying, if we're going to allocate and distribute wealth in society, if we're going to take care of people's needs, public goods around healthcare, around living wage, let's say, around environmental health and protection, then we should make those decisions based on the data that we can collect, but we're collecting particular types of data because we are aiming towards a government that will meet the needs of the people in the society. And we need data to do that, to enable us to do it.
Great, thank you. So I think that's the last question we're going to have time to ask for the Q&A portion. Dean Colvin, did you have any final remarks you wanted to say before Hanni and I say our thank yous?
Well, I did just want to thank you guys for organizing this. I think we've had a really great discussion. I really appreciate all the panelists' comments and all the questions we got. There's a ton of great questions. I know there was a bunch on the Q&A posted, and hopefully we'll be able to answer a good number of those. But thank you, Emily and Hanni, for organizing this, and great job.
Thanks. Hanni and I would also like to thank everyone else who made the event possible. Again, our 5 amazing panelists, Dean Colvin for facilitating, Allison and David for doing all the tech logistics, Jesse and Rebecca for helping Hanni and I plan the panel, and to all the attendees who made this event happen. A reminder that a recording of the webinar will be posted on the ILR website, so please feel free to share this with friends or family who are not able to attend tonight but also might be interested in this topic.
Thank you so much, everyone. It has been a real pleasure. Please stay safe.